Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Tom, would you have any other ways that people push back that maybe I haven't mentioned? And then I want to also make sure that we touch base on this topic that I think both of you talked about, which is we tend to talk at church like we're talking to people who aren't LGBT, like we already know who is and who isn't, and the complete unawareness that people sitting right next to us might be dealing with these issues, and we say things that we would never say in front of people who maybe are LGBTQ.
I think the challenge, and this is a conversation I've had many times with people who are coming to the defense of the church, is I'm not really concerned about where blame falls. I am not really overly concerned about theology other than it's causing harm. And you know, for straight people in the church, which is the vast majority, the theology is the most important part. When you're LGBT or working in the LGBT community, you recognize that lives are at stake. And the stakes aren't whether the theology is right and wrong, but the stakes are life and death. So the theology is secondary. When we can put an emphasis, and I loved in the McIntosh's video that just came out, she says, I just learned, and I'm summarizing, she said, I just recognized I needed to love and leave everything else at Jesus's feet and the atonement, and everything will get worked out that way. How wonderful. What a great way, you know, making heads or tails of the doctrine, it's not working out. My default is going to be love. My default is going to be acceptance, because I know in my heart, going back to Christ's first two commandments, if I've laid a foundation of love, the rest will work out. But that's not typically the response in Mormonism, because there's such a very intense concern about judgment, about right and wrong, about condoning what they think is evil, that it masks their ability to express love first.
Yeah, and what's tragic about that is that then it becomes this conversation about who's the better Mormon, instead of really wondering why are these issues happening to begin with, right? So for allies, they're often times pitted as, not being faithful enough or not following the counsel of the prophets, and it becomes this obedience competition measuring stick, instead of really talking about issues that should be concerning all of us and that we could all be united on regardless of where we're at in the spectrum of Mormonism.
Well, there's a lot of things right now in the church in the last 10 years, a very much I don't know how notable a shift, I don't know how you measure those things, but it's very much a obedience-oriented church. And you look back to 2003, Elder Nelson gives a talk called Divine Love. And pretty much he says explicitly in the talk, God's love is conditional, and it's conditional on you being obedient and doing the things that he tells you to do. And when you're LGBT, you are put into a trap, because the price to be obedient to what they're asking is nowhere near the price of what a straight person has to give up. And that's really what it comes down to, is as straight, we don't even realize the privilege, and we don't even understand what the sacrifice means to ask a person to be celibate their whole life. We don't even conceptually, we think it's just the old widowed woman in the ward who husband maybe died early. And that's what we're asking. Except that you're talking to a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, and you're saying, from your point, you will never have a family. You will never have a love. You know, every romantic movie in the world you've ever seen, every notion of eternal family that you've taken in and listened to since the time you could hear, that's lost.
Including romantic love and sexuality, both huge things that
For sure.
everybody
Everything.
wants, or
That's
most
what
people
we're asking
want.
of them, and we're not even thinking of what that price is for them.
Yeah, and the idea that we ask the same of them as we do of single people is so mischaracterized, because we're constantly encouraging single people to get married, to date, to take risks for romance. I mean, it's completely different. It's
The whole youth program is built around the messaging, and that's part of what I talked about in my article, Rejection in the Family, is all the ideas being ingested by a young Mormon kid, from primary singing the songs all the way through deacon, teacher, priest, young women's, all of the levels. Everything is building up to a singular event, being marrying, starting your own family. It's the ideal. And there is no plan B. Even for active straight members, you know, as an elders quorum president a few years ago, one of the biggest things we were trying to work with was elders who had not progressed in the priesthood. And the primary reason was they never went on a mission, because there is no plan B. If the ideal doesn't work out for you in some way, shape, or form, Mormonism doesn't have anything for you. You have failed.
And to really think about the complications and consequences of that for people's mental health, when the gospel is supposed to be the good news.
I have to point out that's a cultural thing. It doesn't have to, it's not intrinsic to everything Mormon that there's no, sort of plan B. It's just the way our communities exists within our sort of typical Mormon communities, right? The attitudes. But I also want to point out another thing that is also cultural, and this brings back to Becky and Scott give an excellent example of this, and I wish people will pay more attention to their story. But Becky McIntosh, who starred in this recent video, right, that was just released yesterday or the day before by the Mormon Newsroom, she talked about how when she was in the early stages of discussing this issue with her son, that she would say some things that she thought were very helpful, but that her son later made her understand were actually really rejecting. And this is really important because, as Caitlin Ryan pointed out in the research, and as the Family Acceptance Project research shows, there's rejecting behaviors that are damaging, but the person giving the rejecting behaviors have no idea these are rejecting behaviors. And this is really kind of common in Mormonism. You hear people say, well, the best thing you can do for a gay person is warn them that they're, going astray and that this will lead them to eternal damnation or whatever. Unfortunately, that never works, but this is what Mormons believe. We have to warn them of their, quote, deviant behavior and help them with their, quote, deviant behavior. People who go on with that attitude are never going to be able to say something that doesn't sound rejecting. And so what it takes is, some real education on people to just kind of say, well, I have to learn what is rejecting behaviors, and I have to learn how to talk with people who are LGBT, but also anyone who doesn't necessarily believe in Mormonism the way I was hoping to. I have to learn to talk to them in a way that isn't rejecting. And it's not just LGBT people who are rejected, but lots of people, I have family members who aren't LGBT, but who are just really feeling really super rejected by their Mormon families because they don't believe. And their families are kind of taking the attitude, well, I'm trying to help save their soul by showing this tough love to them or whatever. I don't know, but it's not working. It's just making them hate the Mormon church and making them feel like their family's brainwashed or whatever. It's not helping the situation. But the people who are making the mistakes just have no idea. And that's the problem, is the rejection is unrecognized and not perceived as rejection. It's perceived as trying to help save their soul, but it's not saving their soul. It's sometimes driving them to suicide. And that's kind of hard to talk about. It's a really, it is a cultural thing. But the McIntoshes got that. They got that early on, and they understood that. And that's what made them, that's what made their son willing to appear in this video promoting, that's basically promoting Mormonism, even though he's no longer a Mormon, because he had parents who were Mormons who were responsive to his, what his feelings were and what was really coming across as rejecting to him. And they were willing to adapt and change. And they are still Mormon. Becky and Scott McIntosh are super Mormon, they totally believe in it. But they were able to make this adaptation that accommodated the son. Now, I'm not saying I don't hope the church will also get some more generous policies towards gays, but we don't have to wait for that. And it's a cultural thing. But the church could certainly do a lot to help promote the ideas that the McIntoshes were trying to represent. And the Montgomerys also are role model for all those years. They were the first ones to become public when they made that film. And the families that did the I'll Walk With You videos, a project I was somewhat involved in, were also, great at giving that role models to families on how to stay Mormon. And it's very possible you can stay Mormon and still do the best thing for your children, although often that includes allowing the children to leave the church, because right now that's kind of the only option for most LGBT people.
And I think that's what's so great about the Family Acceptance Project materials, is that it does not require a change in belief or values in that regard. It really just teaches this distinction between rejecting and accepting behaviors that you're talking about. And it has a wonderful way of explaining those in very simple terms. I really recommend that everybody look that up, or even have a few on hand, whether you have LGBTQ members in your family or not. It's always good to have that on hand to give out to people who you might realize are struggling or don't have very many resources. So yeah, that's a great resource. I guess to end our interview, because I know our time is coming to an end, what I'd like to finish with is kind of a discussion on what we do know. I think there is a lot of great research out there. We've touched on some of these things along the interview. If we could give a clear understanding of what research has shown to be at least very strong correlates, and then hopefully that can get us to our closing thoughts and give people some good resources to be thinking about. My thoughts are not obviously to go into a deep dive into the research, but what are some of the things that we do know? We do know that rejection does hurt LGBTQ kids, and it hurts them through, like you said, mental health, drug addiction, quality of life, suicidality. We know that. We know that the numbers are higher when there's rejection practices from the family system and also the community system. We know the LGBTQ population does suffer higher suicidal rates than the rest of the population, exponentially so. And we know that acceptance types of practices do help with that and do help people. Like you said at the beginning, we're seeing rates where gay marriage has been passed in states where there's more tolerance, things of that nature, that people do better, and not just LGBTQ people.
If anything, I think the strongest indirect evidence that's present in Utah is the homelessness rate in Utah. You've got, of the homeless youth in Utah, 40 to 50% are LGBT kids. And yet they're making up way under 10% of the population, but an exponentially higher number of the homeless youth, which speaks not directly to suicide, but it does speak directly to rejection and the family, and not being in a safe space in their families and feeling like either they have to leave or are being kicked out. One of the two. Either one has devastating consequences. And a parent has a lot of control over.
I can just do a quick rundown of our list. We have national studies showing that LGBTQ teens are at a higher risk of suicide attempts. We have the Family Acceptance Project research showing that highly rejecting families, the LGBTQ kids in that, have an exponentially higher rate of suicide attempts. We know that schools with explicit anti-homophobia interventions and gay-straight alliances reduce the odds of suicidal thoughts and attempts among LGBT students. We know that suicide is the number one cause of death in Utah youth. We know that teen suicide is lower where there's an LGBTQ supportive environment. Also, adult suicides are lower. The communities where homosexuality is tolerated, the mental health outcomes are much better and are actually similar to the mental health outcomes for non-LGBTQ people. In other words, they don't have an increased rate of mental health problems when they're in tolerant communities. Like Tom mentioned, the suicide, the CDC data we've been talking about, the importance of community supports in lowering suicide, and the fact that we know that LGBTQ Mormons leave the church in much higher numbers, and so they're losing that community of support, which also is going to lead to worse mental health outcomes, including higher suicide. And then there's just the massive amount of anecdotal evidence that clinicians like yourselves and activist people like Tom and Wendy are getting. So that kind of is the brief summary of.
Yeah, because I
that's
want
kind of
to.
what makes us say that, yeah, there's a lot of scientific evidence.
Exactly, it's not just anecdotal.
And then these new studies, the new study of that I discussed for the same-sex marriage, but the numbers, just the numbers of the suicides is just.
And a lot of this stuff can be found in the Department of Health and Human Services websites. I mean, this is good research, being done on a national level that obviously applies to our population as well. So that's exactly very helpful. It's exactly what I was looking for. And so
the two things that I would add that Daniel didn't mention is that Utah has jumped from 11th out of the 50 states to number 6 in 1 year. And that is also on top of a trend that started 7 or 8 years ago. In fact, as far back as 2007. And the trend is measurable as well. And the fact that that trend corresponds to the trend of political activism by the church is the correlation we're tying to all of this other data.
And obviously, there will be much more research, and will be interesting to see, unfortunately, the data that we have for this year, because, for 2016.
You know what? Just to add on to that, though, is, our strongest evidence is the anecdotal, obviously, because the data is not going to follow for another year or two. And the tragedy that Wendy and I have been experiencing for the last 2 years is we're standing on the soapbox screaming at the top of our lungs to whoever will listen, and the numbers continue to follow everything that we said a year ago and the year before that. And I can't even imagine what the 2016 numbers are going to be that are all going to be post November exclusion policy. And we have nothing even in the works from a government or religious standpoint that is even going to curb this. And so
and it's tragic.
It's really, sometimes you feel like you're yelling at the wall for all that people are listening.
Yeah, like you're in the trenches and trying to stop somebody's bleeding and nobody's coming to help. And it's infuriating, it's tragic, it really leads to a lot of compassion fatigue, I think, for many of us in the trenches. And it's highly concerning because we don't want to have to convince people in order to stop people from dying, right? I mean, that just should be something we should all be on board on, especially as Latter-day Saints. And so it's just...
I'm just praying that there's a tipping point where, because it's just costing more lives at this point. What is the tipping point where enough lives have been lost and enough words have been said that people will be willing to put aside their political and religious resistance to exploring this and saying, okay, we need to address rejection in the church? I'm not saying this has to be some massive anti-Mormon campaign. We need to study rejection in the context of the gospel. When the ideals don't work out, what plan is available for kids, for adults, to get back on track?
Well, and I know that all three of us know people who either have lost their lives to suicide, who are LGBTQ, or know family members who have sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and family members and friends who have lost people. And so I know we all come at this with heavy hearts and very concerned souls. I would like to just open it up for closing remarks from both of you and let you just both petition listeners as far as being allies and being support systems for so many among us who are suffering, I think, very unnecessarily. Tom, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in. In my article, Rejection in the Family, I just closed with a few points. Please be aware that you have LGBT friends and youth who you don't know are LGBT. The things that we say matter. You don't know if the crowd of people you're standing in at church, if any one of them are LGBT. You got to know that in holding to your ideals, standing for what you believe, you have to be conscious that those ideals leave very little room for an LGBT person to even exist. You have to put some thought into what this impact, because, to stand against same-sex marriage costs somebody nothing. Doesn't mean they have to obey or do anything in their life. But the consequence to somebody else that's LGBT is almost everything. Be conscious that through no fault of their own, LGBT people are feeling high levels of rejection, often in the same spaces you are feeling safe. While for you the stakes may be theoretical or doctrinal, for an LGBT person, the stakes are often life and death. Mm. And if the same labels of counterfeit and apostate were applied to your marriage by anyone, you would consider it hate speech. And you know what? If you're lucky, you're going to learn that LGBT people are some of the most loving, amazing people you've ever known in your life. It's an opportunity to expand the love and the experience of your whole life, to put aside some of these ideals and rejecting behaviors.
Thank you, Tom. Daniel?
Yeah, and I just want to challenge people to try to learn what the rejecting behaviors are and how your style of how judgment might be seeping into your conversations, and take it on as a missionary work. Because if you're every Mormon considers themselves an ambassador for their church, but if they're doing it in a way that's alienating people, they might want to reflect on that. You might want to reflect on that. And Christ gave us the example that love trumps everything, and Good Samaritan and who he chose to associate with really show us that. I also want to plug for what resources are there. I think that there are, I want to plug the I Walk With You project. There's ldswalkwithyou.org, a series of videos of parents who, like the Montgomerys, were willing to go on camera and explain how they kind of resolved the issue. And specifically in that project, it's active LDS parents. And there's also a Facebook group, which is a support community. And the Mama Dragons have become a fantastic political force and an activist force for LGBTQ people. But there's also plenty of people who maybe aren't that comfortable with strong positions they take, which I love the positions they take, but I also realize that there's some people who need to do things in a more conservative way. But those parents can still also be great parents to their LGBTQ children, and they can stay active in the church if that's where their beliefs have them in the church. But they often need support, and they also need some feedback on how to do that. And so we've got a community of parents like that at the Walk With You. They have a Facebook group run by other parents. And so if anyone, if there's a parent who hears this who would like a support community of active LDS parents, please try to find us. If you go to the ldswalkwithyou.org site, there's a link you can press there to send a communication so you can get into that group.
And I'll make sure that I link to all of these resources as well on the website where the podcast is, yes.
And I'm also just thrilled that the church has now put out a video. First we only had the Montgomerys, and we tried to follow a similar idea with the Walk With You project, is what the Montgomerys showed us when they did the Family Acceptance Project video. But now, I'm thrilled that there's actually a church video. Well, the first website also had Judy Finch, who showed a similar sort of attitude. So there's been a few lights here and there flicker on and off, but I hope this is going to be a trend. So anyway.
Well, thank you. And I just want to thank you both so much for the advocacy that I know that both of you have been involved in for many years. And we have crossed paths throughout the years ourselves. And I just really appreciate everything that you do. It's very heartening to have people like you and your family, Tom, to look towards and to have as examples in our community.
Well, I tell you, I will be the first person who will be ecstatic when these trends turn. It's tragic. It's disheartening. I don't see them changing until we change things on the ground, but I will love it when they do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom and Daniel, for your time tonight.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always because I love you. An ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.